Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a profound theological lecture on divine perfection and sincerity. Okay, let's dive into this. Is it actually possible for any human being to be completely flawless? Now, what's really interesting here is humans can't be mukamel, flawless, but only kamil, constantly maturing. This leads us to El-Hüsna. It's the absolute, ultimate perfection that belongs entirely and exclusively to God. And this brilliantly illustrates how the Arabic prefix el separates infinite divine traits from our limited human capabilities. So, the crucial point is, these Quranic verses strictly reserve absolute, unblemished perfection for God alone, no exceptions. Because God actually created time itself, His infinite knowledge isn't bound by human constraints like before or after. The Quran shows even the most revered prophets making mistakes. It proves absolutely no human is entirely flawless. Attributing perfection to someone strips them of their humanity. Seriously, idolizing leaders ultimately destroys who they really are. Let's see how this builds. Expecting impossible perfection literally forces leaders into hypocrisy, destroying their true moral core. Since we're all inherently flawed, God doesn't demand perfection. He just desires our deep, genuine, and profound sincerity. Take this powerful story from Uhud. A companion drew water all day until his hands literally blistered and bled. That agonizing labor earned just 1.5 measures of dates, and he donated them all completely. While the wealthy gave hundreds of camels, God accepted his humble dates because of that unmatched, ultimate sincerity. We see this today, like a vendor donating his entire stock of socks to Gaza out of pure sincerity. So how will you reflect your own limited but completely genuine goodness in the world today?
All right, welcome to the Explainer. Today we are taking a really profound theological journey based on a deeply compelling lecture titled El-Esma-ul Husna, Divine Perfection and True Solidarity. We're going to be unpacking some pretty heavy concepts today, moving all the way from the ancient root meanings of divine names right into real-world, deeply emotional humanitarian crises. I'm honestly so excited to guide you through this material because it completely reshapes how we view leadership, human nature, and ultimately our responsibility to one another. Let's jump right in.
So listen to this question. Could calling a human being flawless be the greatest harm you can do to them? It sounds totally counterintuitive, right? I mean, usually calling someone perfect is a massive compliment. But our source material makes this really striking argument that demanding perfection from a human being is actually a profound form of spiritual and psychological harm. And to understand why this matters so much, we have to look at the language itself.
Section 1. The difference between mukamel and kamil. Divine versus human nature.
Okay, to answer our opening question, we need to dig into the Arabic term El-Husna. Now, a lot of the time, this gets loosely translated as simply beautiful, but the speaker emphasizes that it actually implies an absolute, static, and completely finished perfection. In Arabic, this absolute perfection is called mukammel, and the absolutely crucial takeaway here is that this flawless, completed state belongs exclusively to God. It is literally impossible for any created being to possess it.
So because absolute perfection is strictly divine, the speaker argues that the concept of insani mukamel, meaning a perfectly flawless human, is just an absolute impossibility. It's an oxymoron. Instead, humans can only ever be insani kamil. Now, a kamil human isn't flawless, not at all. Rather, they're on an ongoing journey of maturation. They are actively walking the path. Basically, perfection is a destination that's already reached by the divine, but maturity, that's the road walked by the human.
And to back this up, the source lays out some pretty striking theological proof from the Quran. The speaker points out that even the absolute heavy hitters, the prophets themselves, were inherently flawed. I mean, think about it. Adam sinned. Jonah totally fled from his duties when the pressure got too high. Moses accidentally committed a crime before his prophethood, and David required some serious, deep repentance. So the logic here is clear. If even the prophets, the highest examples of humanity we have, were flawed and needed to repent, well, ordinary humans are for sure flawed too. There is simply no such thing as a perfect person.
Section 2. The great danger of idolizing humans. The psychological risks of demanding perfection.
Let's shift gears and look at the real-world consequences of forgetting this fundamental rule. Like, what actually happens when we start projecting divine qualities onto our religious, political, or community leaders? Well, the speaker mentions this follower who actually believed their leader knew exactly how many times they turned over in bed at night. I mean, it's kind of funny, yes, but it's a deeply critical illustration from the source text. It just perfectly highlights the absolute absurdity and the profound toxicity of projecting divine qualities, like all-seeing knowledge, onto a regular human being.
And why is this so dangerous? Because when you treat a human as infallible, you aren't actually honoring them. You're ruining their morality. You literally strip away their humanity and force them to play a deceptive role. Think about it. If a leader knows their followers expect them to be absolutely flawless, they have to start hiding their very human moments, like eating, making mistakes, or just resting. They get forced into this corner of hypocrisy just to maintain the illusion. It completely corrupts both the follower and the leader.
Section 3. Being built by revelation, the antidote.
So how do we avoid this trap? Well, the speaker introduces an antidote to all this spiritual toxicity and takes a really firm stance. True grounding must come from being built by the Quran itself. It really doesn't matter what sect, order, or group label you happen to affiliate with. Whether you're Sunni, Shia, Salafi, Sufi, you name it. None of that matters if your foundation isn't built directly upon the text. You have to rely on the revelation, not on the supposed fake perfection of whatever group's leader you follow.
Section 4. Faith, intention, and sincerity. How true sacrifice is measured.
Now, you might be wondering, if we're all just inherently flawed humans who can't offer perfection, how do we actually demonstrate true, sincere faith? How is our sacrifice measured? The source shares this incredible historical scene. There was a call for charity before a battle, and these wealthy individuals were coming forward donating massive amounts, like 50 or 100 camels fully loaded with wealth. But then, a poor man steps up. He had worked all day drawing water until his hands literally blistered, just to earn 1.5 measures of dates, and he placed his tiny, physically exhausting donation right on top of those massive piles of wealth. Naturally, some onlookers mocked him, like, what difference is a handful of dates going to make?
But that story brings us to this absolutely beautiful quote, summarizing the speaker's whole point. God looks at the essence of the heart, not the tyranny of numbers. The divine scale doesn't care about quantity, it measures sincerity. That poor man gave literally everything he had. The wealthy? They just gave a fraction of their excess. So true perfection isn't what's required of us, but absolute sincerity definitely is.
And the speaker brings this historical lesson right into the modern day. He shares this super touching story of a local street vendor who just couldn't make any sales one day. But instead of giving up and going home, he packed up his entire inventory of socks and donated the whole shebang to a charity drive for Gaza. Just like the man with the dates, this vendor gave up his entire livelihood for a cause. It is the exact same sincerity centuries apart.
Section 5. Gaza and the Responsibility of the Ummah. Contemporary Solidarity and Action.
This brings us to the highly emotional final segment of our source material, connecting these theological concepts of sincerity, imperfection, and revelation to the ongoing crisis in Gaza. The speaker's community isn't just sitting around talking about theology. They are taking concrete humanitarian action. According to the source, they're actively sending fully loaded aid trucks into the region. They've pledged to cover the medical and living expenses for orphan children. They've even initiated a brother-family project to completely financially support families who have lost their primary providers. And looking ahead, they are actively planning the long-term construction of a Turkish hospital and an orphanage school.
And we really need to ground this abstract discussion in the real, raw human stakes here. The speaker actually shares a personal loss in the text. His own extended family in Gaza lost its head of household, which left 8 young, orphaned children behind. So this isn't just news on a screen for him. It's incredibly personal. It's a stark reminder that behind every single statistic we hear about, there is a grieving family. But despite all of that, the speaker refuses to remain in despair. Outlining his vision for the future, he argues that the community's responsibility goes way beyond just immediate crisis relief. Following a ceasefire, he says the goal has to be massive, unprecedented rebuilding. He envisions making Gaza so incredibly prosperous, with such a high standard of living and global importance, that its very prosperity acts as a deterrent against any future conflicts. The ultimate goal is to make it a true beacon of resilience.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer. I want to leave you with this deeply provocative challenge taken straight from the source. Are you merely reading the Quran, or are you being built by it? It's a real challenge to truly internalize everything we've talked about today. Are we just passively consuming information, or are we allowing it to mature us, to make us more sincere, and to drive us toward genuine solidarity with those who are suffering? Think about that for a while.
Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. And as always, keep learning.
You know, it's this really fascinating, almost like mind-bending paradox to think about.
Yeah.
How can the simple, like just the biological, completely unconscious act of taking a breath,
Yeah.
how can that be framed as a profound, bulletproof philosophical argument for the existence of God?
Right. It's wild.
It is. And then on the flip side of that exact same coin, how can the act of demanding absolute, unblemished perfection from our human leaders, you know, whether they're political or spiritual or whatever, how can that actually be the exact recipe for completely destroying their morality?
Well, it really it forces you to completely reevaluate how we assign value in the world. I mean, you have something as involuntary and honestly mundane as breathing.
Right, something we don't even think about.
Exactly, and that's tied directly to the ultimate divine reality. And then you have something as intentional and seemingly noble as idolizing a leader, looking up to them, tied to sheer human destruction.
Yeah.
It is a massive juxtaposition that just challenges all our basic assumptions about, you know, what is sacred and what is toxic.
And that tension, right, that vast, really complicated spectrum between the absolute perfection of the divine and the inherent messy, just necessary flaws of humanity.
Yes.
That is exactly the worldview we are unpacking today. We are looking at a deeply philosophical, just incredibly wide-ranging lecture by the Islamic scholar Mustafa İslamoğlu.
It covers so much ground.
It really does. And I should say, right up front, for you listening, this source material touches on some very politically charged current events, obviously theology, doctrines, and our mission today for this deep dive is not to take a side.
Right, we're not endorsing anything here.
Exactly. We're not validating a specific religious doctrine or pushing a political viewpoint. We're just here to act as your expert guides, exploring these fascinating arguments and historical perspectives exactly as they're presented in the source text.
Yeah, we're just laying out his framework.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because right out of the gate, before he even touches on theology or history or like the linguistics of Arabic, he spends a significant amount of time attacking the way we actually consume information.
Oh, he really goes after.
He argues that skimming the surface of knowledge, which is basically the default mode of our entire modern society, let's be honest, is a massive disservice to the human mind.
His core philosophy on learning, it's just this staunch refusal to give what he calls polished, superficial information. Yeah. He actually starts by addressing his own pacing in the lecture. He notes that he spent multiple lengthy sessions just trying to explain the introduction to a single theological concept.
Just the intro.
Right, the introduction to the Esma-ul Husna, which is the most beautiful names of God. And he anticipates that people are going to get impatient. He knows it.
People want the soundbite.
But he essentially says, look, I am not stretching this out for the sake of hearing myself talk. The subject is infinitely deep, and therefore our approach has to be serious.
Which feels like such a direct challenge to, you know, the era of the 5-minute summary and the bullet point takeaway. If someone just wants the bottom line, he's basically saying the bottom line is useless without the foundation.
Precisely. If you only memorize the polished conclusion without understanding the underlying reasoning, like the actual mechanics of how that conclusion was reached, you haven't actually learned anything.
You're just repeating it.
You are just mimicking. You might be able to, you know, repeat a fact at a dinner party to sound smart, but if someone challenges you on it, you will collapse because you don't possess the architecture of the idea.
To explain this, he uses a really evocative agricultural metaphor, doesn't he?
He does. He argues that for knowledge to actually bear fruit, to be productive and sustainable in your life, it must have roots and fringes beneath the soil.
Let's play with that metaphor for a second. If knowledge is a tree, and we only ever focus on the visible fruit, right? The quick takeaways, the life hacks, the easily tweetable quotes.
This is stuff that gets likes.
Exactly. What happens when a storm hits? Like a crisis of faith, or a personal tragedy, or some massive societal upheaval.
The tree topples over.
Just immediately.
Immediately, because there is nothing anchoring it to the earth. The speaker insists that true learning requires the painful, slow work of grappling with the whys and the hows, that subterranean, unseen network of the subject.
You have to let those roots take hold in the dark.
Yes, before you can ever expect to harvest anything useful. He says he deliberately talks until he can look into the eyes of his audience and see that the information has taken root, that they are actually capable of carrying the weight of the concepts.
And the very first root he wants to plant, and this is a heavy one, is the sheer linguistic weight of a single concept, this El-Esma-ul Husna. Specifically, he zeroes in on the word Husna.
Right.
Now, in a basic surface-level translation. If you just Google it, it just means the most beautiful. But he argues that in the architecture of the Arabic language, it carries so much more mechanical nuance.
Yeah, it is not just an aesthetic beauty. It's not like a pretty sunset. It denotes the absolute beautiful, the only beautiful, the ever beautiful. But to synthesize all of those intersecting meanings into a single operational concept, he proposes one word to encapsulate it: perfection.
Perfection, or in the language of the lecture, mukamel.
But he doesn't just use the word perfection loosely. He draws a massive, definitive line in the sand between two words that, honestly, most of us probably use interchangeably in everyday conversation.
Right, mukamel and Camille.
Yeah, mukamel and Camille. And this distinction is the absolute bedrock for every single philosophical, sociological, and political argument he makes for the rest of the lecture.
It really is the engine for his entire worldview.
Okay, I want to dissect that for a second, because to an outsider, it sounds like we are just debating synonyms. What is the actual mechanical difference between those two concepts?
It is fundamentally the difference between a process and a finalized state.
Okay.
So, according to his linguistic framework, mukamo refers to an entity or a state where the process of perfection is completely 100% finalized.
It's done.
It is done. The journey is over. It is static, absolute, and utterly flawless. There's literally no room for improvement because the absolute pinnacle has already been achieved. So mukamel is the ultimate destination where nothing else can be added. It's a closed loop.
Correct. Camille, on the other hand, describes an ongoing, dynamic process. A person or a thing that is Camille is on the path toward perfection.
They're working on it.
Yes. They are striving toward maturity, but the process is absolutely not finished. They are in a state of becoming rather than a state of static being.
So it's like, if I use an analogy, it's the difference between the completed masterpiece hanging in a museum, which would be mukamel.
Right, you don't add paint to the Mona Lisa.
Exactly. Versus an artist who is actively working on a canvas in their studio, trying to get the shading right. That's Camille.
That is a perfect way to look at it. And this leads to a really bold sociological statement from him. He says that the phrase insana mukamel, which translates to a perfect, finalized human being, is a fundamental oxymoron.
Because humans are never finalized.
Exactly. It is a linguistic and biological impossibility. He says the only correct phrase is insana Camille. A human being is a creature that is perpetually on the path of maturity. Every single human is inherently a work in progress.
Now, I have to push back here, or at least, voice the immediate skepticism that a lot of people listening to this are probably feeling right now.
Sure.
If we look at human history, especially religious history, it is literally built on the idea of infallible figures. Wait, aren't prophets, saints, and revered religious leaders considered to be perfect?
That is the common assumption.
Right. We are constantly taught that they are without sin, that they are the ultimate role models. If anyone on earth is going to be classified as mukamel, wouldn't it be them?
That is exactly the assumption he anticipates, and he completely dismantles it using the very foundational texts that revere these figures.
Wow.
Because your skepticism makes total sense. We are conditioned to view these historical figures as flawless marble statues. But the speaker argues that if you actually read the text, specifically the Quran in this context, even the prophets were still on the easel.
They were still Camille.
Yes, they were not finalized, flawless masterpieces.
So he's explicitly saying the prophets made mistakes, because that feels like it would be highly controversial in a lot of traditional circles.
It can be very controversial, but he brings the receipts directly from the text to prove that acknowledging their flaws isn't an insult, it is a theological necessity.
Okay, lay it out. Who does he mention?
He goes through a really fascinating list. He starts with Adam, pointing to the original lapse in judgment, the literal foundational mistake of humanity.
Right, the apple or the fruit.
Exactly. Then he brings up Jonah.
The story of the whale.
Right, but what is the actual mechanism of that story? Jonah didn't just, accidentally end up in the ocean. He famously fled from his prophetic duty because it was too difficult. The work was too frustrating, the people were too stubborn, and he just ran away from his responsibility.
He quit.
He quit. The text portrays a moment of deep human weakness and frustration. Then the speaker mentions Moses.
What did Moses do?
Before his formal prophethood, Moses intervened in a fight and committed an accidental murder, striking a man too hard. The text describes Moses crying out in deep distress, realizing he had wronged his own soul. He mentions David, a king and a prophet who required profound, desperate repentance for his missteps.
He even brings the Prophet Muhammad into this, doesn't he?
Prominently, he references a very specific, well-known chapter in the Quran called Abis, which translates to, he frowned.
Okay, what happens in that chapter?
In this chapter, the Prophet Muhammad is actively engaging with these wealthy, influential leaders of the city, trying to convince them of his message. A blind, poor man approaches him, seeking to learn, and the Prophet, totally focused on the VIPs, turns away and frowns at the blind man.
He ignores the marginalized guy to focus on the powerful guys, which honestly is the most relatable human instinct ever. You're trying to build a movement, you want the influencers on your side?
Exactly. It's a strategic calculation. But the Quranic text immediately and sternly reprimands the prophet for this. The divine revelation corrects his human prioritization.
Wow.
The speaker points out that the very first revelations sent down carry this inherent implication that no human, not even the chosen messenger, can perfectly, flawlessly execute a divine command without guidance and correction.
You know, thinking about this, stripping away the marble statue perfection from these figures doesn't degrade them at all. I actually think it elevates the human condition.
How so?
Well, if a prophet is an alien, flawless being sent from the heavens, then their example is useless to me. I can't relate to an alien.
Right, they have a cheat code.
Exactly. But if they struggle, if they get frustrated like Jonah, or make the wrong geopolitical calculation like Muhammad in that moment, or carry deep regret like Moses,
Yeah.
and they still manage to do extraordinary things, that normalizes the human struggle.
It grounds them.
It says, look, even the best of us stumble. Your flaws do not disqualify you from greatness. They are the very material you have to work with.
What's fascinating here is that is a crucial insight for the individual believer. It maintains the relatability of the figures. But from the speaker's philosophical standpoint, it does something even more important structurally.
Okay, what's that?
It maintains a strict, impenetrable boundary. If humans, even the absolute greatest, most revered humans in history, are inherently flawed and in a constant state of becoming, this Camille state, then absolute finalized perfection, mukmal, must belong exclusively somewhere else.
The flaws of humanity create a conceptual vacuum.
Yes, and that vacuum can only be filled by the divine.
Which brings us right into the grammar of the divine. Because if humans are perpetually the rough draft, who holds the completed masterpiece?
Right.
The speaker dives into the Arabic prefix el, which on a basic level functions somewhat like the English word z. But he argues it is doing infinitely more heavy lifting here than just acting as a definite article.
Yeah, in Arabic grammar, when el is attached to the names or attributes of God, forming Esma-ul Husna, it doesn't just specify a noun like the car or the house. It signifies absolute, unshared exclusivity.
Okay, so it's not just a thing, it's the only thing.
Yes. It denotes a reality of perfection that literally cannot be replicated or shared by anything in the created universe.
To explain how this works mechanically, he compares human traits to divine traits.
Yeah.
He says, look, as a human being living your life, you can be Rahim, you can be a merciful person, or you can be Mu'min, you can be someone who trusts others and inspires trust.
Right.
But only God can be Er-Rahim, the absolute merciful, or El-Mu'min, the absolute source of faith and trust.
And the difference isn't just a matter of degree, it's a fundamental difference in the source and the limit of that trait.
Break down the mechanics of that.
So the speaker asks his audience, when a human being exhibits mercy, where does that mercy originate? Did you invent mercy?
No.
No, it is borrowed. It is a capacity that was given to you, like biological and psychological software installed in your brain.
It's leased. We don't own the copyright to mercy.
Exactly. And because it is leased, what is its limit? It is inherently limited by your human capacity. Your mercy is bounded by your mood, your physical energy, your resources, your biases.
Right, like I might feel incredibly merciful and generous toward my best friend who made a mistake.
Right.
But I am absolutely not feeling merciful toward the guy who just cut me off in traffic and flipped me off.
Exactly.
My mercy is highly conditional.
It is finite. But when the prefix el is applied to God, it signifies that the trait is inherent and infinite. God's mercy isn't borrowed from an outside source. It originates from his very essence.
It's self-generating.
Yes. And his compassion isn't bounded by fatigue or bias or a specific situation. It is a universal structural compassion granted to the entire cosmos. So while a human and the divine might share the root word mercy, knowledge, justice, The reality of those traits operates on completely different planes of existence.
Human traits are borrowed and bounded. Divine traits are inherent and boundless.
Exactly.
And this idea of boundlessness, this complete lack of limits, brings us to what I think is the most conceptually difficult, just mind-bending part of the entire deep dive, the philosophy of time.
This is where it gets really deep.
He asks a very simple question with massive implications. How does God know things? As humans, our knowledge is entirely sequential.
Right.
I know what happens at the end of a movie because I watched the beginning, the middle, and then the end. I learned a fact by reading a book today that I didn't know yesterday. But God's knowledge cannot work like that because, as the speaker argues, time itself is a creation.
This is a monumental philosophical hurdle for people. If you posit that there is a creator of the universe, and time is a dimension of that universe, just like space and matter, then time is something that was created.
It didn't just exist alongside God.
No. And the logical absolute is that the creator of a thing cannot be trapped inside the thing they created. You cannot imprison the creator of time within the boundaries of time.
Therefore, words like before and after, or past and future, are completely meaningless when applied to the divine.
The speaker calls them absurdities. They are human metrics trying to measure something that exists entirely outside the metric.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Okay, let's try an analogy here, because wrapping the human brain around timelessness is almost impossible.
It really is.
Think of an author who's writing an epic novel. The characters inside that book are completely bound by the timeline of the story. For a character standing in Chapter 5, Chapter 1 is the ancient past, and Chapter 10 is the unknown, mysterious future. They can only experience their reality sequentially, word by word, page by page. But the author is sitting at a desk, holding the entire physical book in their hands all at once.
Yeah.
To the author, Chapter 1, Chapter 5, and Chapter 10 all exist simultaneously. The author can flip from the birth of a character to their death in a second, because the author exists completely outside the timeline of the universe they created.
That is an excellent structural analogy, and it really highlights the cognitive friction the speaker is talking about. The characters in your book cannot fathom how the author knows the ending, because the character's biological and cognitive structure only operates in a linear fashion.
They don't have the hardware for it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Similarly, the human mind, the speaker argues, is entirely incapable of operating outside of time. We are biologically chained to the sequence of cause and effect of before and after. Our memory relies on the past. Our anxiety relies on the future.
We are fish trying to comprehend the concept of dry land. We don't even have the sensory organs for it.
Yes. He even theorizes that the concept of heaven or the afterlife is essentially the state of transcending time. Like reaching a state of existence, perhaps living at the speed of light, where the biological decay of sequential time no longer applies. But currently, we are trapped in the linear narrative.
And because we are stuck in the sequence, our capacity to comprehend an entity that holds the entire book at once is fundamentally broken.
Yes. And the speaker embraces that brokenness. He leans on historical quotes to validate this cognitive limitation.
Who does he quote?
He quotes the first caliph, Abu Bakr, and the second caliph, Omar, who both expressed deep awe at the incomprehensibility of God. And then he references a famous, brilliant line from the 19th century Ottoman poet Ziya Pasha, "The scale cannot weigh so much weight."
Meaning our human intellect, our rational brain, is a small kitchen scale, and the concept of an infinite, timeless God is a freight train.
Exactly.
If you try to put the train on the scale, you don't measure the train, you just break the scale.
That is the exact mechanism. The speaker argues that the absolute highest form of realizing God is actually the profound, humbling realization of your own inability to comprehend him.
Wow.
To truly know God is to map the absolute boundaries of your own mind. He warns that trying to uncover the core essence of God is a form of supreme arrogance. It is the created, limited mind assuming it has the processing power to decode the infinite creator.
But if we can't comprehend the essence of God, how do we interact with the idea of God at all? This brings us to a part of the linguistic analysis that is incredibly poetic.
Okay.
But I have some serious questions about the mechanics of it.
Okay, let's hear it.
The speaker takes the Arabic word Allah and starts stripping it down, dismantling it letter by letter.
Right.
He says if you remove the first letter, the elif, you are left with Lila, which translates to for God or belonging to God. Then you strip away the next letter, the lam, and you get Lahu, which means to him. Finally, you strip away the second lam, and what are you left with at the very core?
You are left with a single syllable, hu, which simply means he.
Who? And here's where he makes a massive leap. He points out that who isn't just a linguistic pronoun. He says who is the literal, physical, biological sound of taking a breath and exhaling.
Yes.
If you take a deep breath and let it out, the sound your body naturally makes is the soft who.
It is a remarkable observation. He posits that this is not an accident, but an intentional divine design embedded into biology.
That every breath is connected to that.
Exactly. Every single living creature, with every single unconscious breath they take, from the second they are born to the moment they die, is constantly exhaling who. They are biologically testifying to the existence of the divine. Breathing itself, he argues, is a physiological proof of the He attribute of God, the attribute of absolute life.
Okay, hold on. This sounds beautiful. It's very poetic. But I have to push back hard on this.
Sure.
Isn't that just a biological coincidence? When air passes through a human windpipe and over vocal cords, friction happens. It creates a rushing sound. It sounds like who because of anatomy, not theology. How is he taking a basic biological mechanism, air friction, and claiming it is a theological proof? It feels like pareidolia, seeing a face in the clouds and assuming the cloud is trying to talk to you.
That is a very fair rationalist critique. And if you were looking at it strictly through the lens of evolutionary biology, you would dismiss it entirely as an anatomical byproduct. But the speaker is operating within a framework of absolute divine sovereignty.
Okay.
In his worldview, there are no biological coincidences. The anatomy of the windpipe, the physics of air friction, and the linguistic development of the Arabic language were all authored by the same creator.
Ah. So he's saying the author of the biology is also the author of the grammar.
Exactly. He is arguing for a unified theory of reality where physical laws and spiritual truths are perfectly aligned. And he uses this alignment to construct what he sees as the ultimate logical takedown of atheism or the denial of God.
Right, the tautology argument. Walk us through how he structures that.
He says, imagine a person using their breath to speak the sentence, God does not exist. What is actually happening in that moment?
They're exhaling.
Yes. That person is actively using the life force given to them, the very biological mechanism of breathing that constantly murmurs, who, to articulate the denial of the source of that breath.
It's a performative contradiction.
Yes. He calls it a logical fallacy, a tautology of absurdity. You are utilizing the very mechanism you are trying to refute.
It would be like writing a book to prove that language doesn't exist. The act of writing it disproves the thesis.
Precisely. You are using the physical proof of existence to declare non-existence. This entire linguistic and biological journey, from the exclusivity of El to the timelessness of the creator, down to the physiological reality of the word who, is completely designed to establish one immovable truth in the speaker's framework. Absolute, unshared capability and perfection belong to God alone.
And this is where the deep dive gets incredibly relevant to our everyday lives, because this isn't just an abstract theological exercise meant for a seminary classroom.
No, it has teeth.
The speaker takes this established truth, that only God is perfect, and he forcefully applies it to human sociology. He applies it to how we interact with our leaders.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, he references specific Quranic verses, Taha 8 and Araf 180, which state that the most beautiful names, the ultimate perfections, belong only to God. He argues that this is not merely a descriptive statement about God. It is a prescriptive instruction on how to build a psychologically healthy human society.
Because if perfection belongs exclusively to the divine, then what happens when we inevitably project that divine standard onto our human leaders? Whether it's a politician we idolize, a religious scholar we follow, or a CEO we think is a genius.
He says it is an act of sheer destruction. He warns his audience with intense ferocity. Do not attribute perfection to your elders, your teachers, your leaders.
Because it hurts them.
Yes. And the reason why is profound. The moment you demand or expect absolute perfection from a human being, you strip them of their humanity. If a person is flawless, they are no longer a person. You have turned them into a static idol. And while you might think you are honoring them with your devotion, you are actually ruining them.
You're ruining them because you are forcing them into an impossible psychological corner. You are forcing them to act.
Exactly. He uses the term alak, which translates to morality, ethics, or inner character. He says that idolizing a leader actively corrupts their alak. Let's think about the psychology of this for a moment.
Okay.
Imagine you are a leader and your followers genuinely believe you are a flawless being. They think you know everything, you never make a mistake, and your judgment is absolute. What happens to you?
Honestly, I would be terrified.
Right.
Because I know I'm not perfect.
Yeah.
I would realize that if they ever see me make a mistake, the entire illusion shatters. So I would have to start hiding my flaws. I couldn't admit when I'm wrong. I couldn't show weakness. I would become obsessed with maintaining the brand.
You become a prisoner of their expectations. You are forced to play a role, to maintain what the speaker calls an image, an image of perfection. You start role-playing a demigod. And the absolute tragedy, according to the speaker, is that the moment a leader starts role-playing, their sincerity vanishes.
They lose who they really are.
Their morality is completely compromised because their entire existence becomes a public relations performance.
They become a fake.
Yes. A perfectly good, knowledgeable, flawed human being is destroyed by the unrealistic, toxic expectations of their followers. The followers think they are elevating the leader, but in reality, they are trapping them in a cage of divine expectations that no biological human can ever fulfill.
He shares a highly specific and honestly pretty funny real-world anecdote to illustrate how absurd and dangerous this cult-like idolization can get. Yeah. He tells his audience about a letter he received from a young student of his. This student was completely awestruck, totally devoted, and wrote to the speaker saying, "Teacher, I am so amazed by you. You've been waking me up for the morning prayer telepathically for a month."
The student genuinely believed that his teacher possessed some flawless, magical, omnipresent power to project his spirit across physical distances and reach into the student's mind every morning.
It's the ultimate guru fantasy. And the speaker's response to this letter is just the most grounded, ego-destroying reality check. He writes back to the student and says, "Son, I have no idea where you are. My mother wakes me up."
It is a brilliant, necessary deflation of the ego.
I love it because he's a highly respected 30-something-year-old scholar at the time, and he's freely admitting to this devoted fan, "Look, I don't have magical powers. I am a tired human being. I struggle to wake up in the morning, too. My mom literally has to come into my room and shake me awake."
He utterly, completely refuses to accept the pedestal the student is trying to force him onto.
He won't let them do it.
And he refuses it because he understands the extreme danger of accepting it. He explains the psychological trap to his audience. He says if he had accepted that praise, if he had stroked his beard and played along saying, "Yes, my son, my spirit is always with you, watching over you," he would have instantly become a toy of Satan.
The power dynamic flips.
Exactly. The leader's ego inflates, the follower becomes even more zealous and dependent, and suddenly the follower's expectations are the ones directing the leader's behavior. The leader becomes addicted to the lust of fame. They become completely reliant on the constant validation of their own fake perfection.
He even points out how exhausting this is. He says that when followers believe a leader is flawless, they can't even stand to see that leader doing normal, mundane, human biological things.
Right.
The leader has to hide when they eat or hide when they go to the bathroom, because performing basic human functions shatters the illusion of their divine status.
He connects this directly back to the Quranic text, noting that the polytheists in Mecca complained about the Prophet Muhammad, saying, "What kind of messenger is this? He eats food and walks in the marketplaces."
They wanted an angel.
They wanted a flawless, floating angel. God sent a flawed, hungry, walking human who needed to buy groceries.
It is such a profound critique of guru culture, of personality cults, of any system where we elevate a human being beyond the status of Camille, a messy work in progress, and pretend they are Mukamil. True spirituality, the speaker argues, isn't found in pretending you don't have human needs or claiming telepathic powers.
True spirituality is about sincere, flawed human action in the very real, very messy world.
And that grounding in reality, moving from the danger of fake performative perfection to the grit of sincere action, takes the lecture into its most emotional, tangible segment, the mathematics of sincerity and the raw ethics of charity.
This is a huge shift in the lecture.
Now, as we transition into this specific segment, we need to look at the real-world context he is discussing. The speaker shifts his focus to his own humanitarian initiatives, specifically focusing on the ongoing crisis in Gaza. Looking at this purely from a sociological and ethical standpoint, ignoring the modern geopolitical debates for a second, he lays out a very specific philosophy on how we measure human goodness.
He mentions an organization called Yardım Eli, which translates to Helping Hand. He talks about sending supply trucks and outlines incredibly ambitious plans to build a fully equipped hospital and a Darul Itam, which is an orphanage and school in Gaza.
Big projects.
Very big. But what is fascinating is that he doesn't dwell on the macro level statistics. He doesn't just list millions of dollars raised. He zooms way in on the micro level of individual personal giving. He shares two very striking anecdotes that define what he calls the true mathematics of charity.
The first is a contemporary story about a man who sells socks from a tiny street stall. The speaker shares that this street vendor had a terrible day. He stood out there all day, but he made 0 sales. He earned absolutely no money. But instead of going home defeated and bitter, he packed up his entire inventory of socks, his entire livelihood, his entire capital for that day, and donated all of them to the charity for Gaza.
He gave 100% of what he had. And then the speaker immediately parallels this modern, humble story with a sweeping historical narrative from the time of the Prophet Muhammad.
The expedition to Tabuk.
Right. The context is the expedition to Tabuk, a time when the early Muslim community was facing a massive impending threat and urgently needed to gather resources for defense. The wealthy members of the community were bringing literal camel loads of wealth, huge, ostentatious bags of gold, armor, and resources. People were standing up and saying, "I will personally outfit 100 soldiers."
It's a massive display of wealth and power, like a charity gala where the billionaires are outbidding each other.
Exactly. But amidst this flood of gold, a very poor companion of the Prophet arrived. This man didn't have camels or gold. He had spent his entire day doing grueling, back-breaking, manual labor pulling heavy, waterlogged buckets out of a deep well.
Brutal work.
The text explicitly focuses on the physical toll, noting that he worked until his hands were covered in bloody blisters and he was drenched in sweat. And his wages for this exhausting labor, 1.5 handfuls of dates.
Literally just a few pieces of fruit for a day of agony.
Yes, and he brought those few dates and quietly placed them on top of the literal mountains of wealth donated by the rich. The speaker notes that human nature is predictable and there are always smart Alecs in any society.
People who are going to judge.
Sure enough, some people standing by began to mock the poor man. They nudged each other and laughed, implying, "Look at this guy. Does God really need his 1 handful of dates? What is that going to accomplish compared to our camels?"
Which is how a capitalist spreadsheet evaluates value, right? Yeah. A handful of dates is mathematically worthless compared to a bag of gold. But the prophet's reaction completely flips the script on how value is actually calculated.
The speaker explains that in the divine calculus, God accepted the handful of dates over the mountains of gold. And the reasoning is a masterclass in the ethics of sincerity. He says, God does not look at the tyranny of numbers.
The tyranny of numbers. I love that phrase.
It's so powerful. God's system does not operate on an Excel spreadsheet. God looks at the percentage of your sacrifice.
Ah, the percentage. The rich men gave an enormous world-changing amount, but it was a tiny, insignificant percentage of their total wealth. They gave out of their extreme abundance. It didn't hurt them to give it.
Right.
But the man with the blistered hands gave a tiny amount, but it was 100% of his earnings.
Yeah.
He gave his life force for that day.
The speaker uses a beautiful modern metaphor to capture this mechanic. He says, the cameras of heaven capture the heart. Human eyes, human cameras only have the lens capacity to see the size of the pile. We are obsessed with volume.
Yeah, we just see the big pile of gold.
But the divine camera penetrates the material and captures the intent, the sacrifice, the fatigue, and the blisters on the hands. The modern sock seller and the historical well drawer are elevated far above the wealthy elites because their sincerity was absolute, even if their resources were minimal.
And it's crucial to note that this isn't just a theoretical feel-good sermon for the speaker. He reveals a deeply personal, very painful stake in the Gaza conflict.
He does.
He shares with his audience that he has 8 extended family members, mostly children, and 1 widowed relative currently living in Gaza right now. He talks openly about the crushing anxiety of losing contact with them, not knowing if they are alive under the rubble or dead.
It serves as a stark, sobering reminder of the human element behind all this high-level theology. He is sketching about patience, the ethics of charity, and submission to divine will, but he is doing so while personally carrying the very real, agonizing weight of potential loss.
He's living it.
He is. It anchors his philosophical arguments in the raw trauma of human existence. He even remarks that if his family members are killed, they will be witnesses for him in the afterlife. But his greatest fear is that he might be held accountable if his own inaction or lack of charity contributed to their suffering.
It is incredibly heavy. And from that intense emotional grounding, the lecture moves into a Q&A format where the audience asks questions. This is where we see the speaker take his framework of deep-rooted knowledge and apply it to highly controversial historical narratives and sectarian divisions.
Yeah, the first question from the audience addresses a deep-seated historical grievance that still impacts Middle Eastern geopolitics today. A listener asks about the narrative that the Arabs betrayed the Ottoman Empire during World War I. They mention a massive figure of 500,000 martyrs and want to know how to understand this traumatic period of history.
This is a massive topic. Why does this specific myth exist, and how does the speaker deconstruct it? He doesn't just say it's fake. He goes right back to his opening philosophy. Do not accept superficial, polished narratives that serve a political agenda.
Exactly. He argues that the history of the late Ottoman period has been heavily, intentionally manipulated by what he calls ideological bigotry. The mechanics of this manipulation are simple. As the empire fell and modern ethno-nationalist states were formed, various factions needed foundational myths to justify their new borders and identities.
It needed a villain.
Right. The narrative of a universal Arab stab in the back served the ideological needs of certain nationalist factions at the time.
So it was a politically convenient story that got accepted as absolute truth, but how does he prove it's wrong?
He demands that his audience dig beneath the surface and look at the actual archives. He specifically points to a massive 3-volume Arabic work by an Egyptian history professor named Abdulaziz Ishnavi, which has been translated as the slandered state or the falsely accused state.
Okay.
The speaker argues that this book, based on meticulous Egyptian and Ottoman archives, proves that the narrative of a universal Arab betrayal is a fabrication. He details how Muslims of all backgrounds, Arabs, Turks, Sunnis, Shias, were deeply unified in their support of the empire, pouring their personal wealth into projects like the Hejaz Railway.
Which highlights his intense, almost visceral rejection of sectarian and ethnic labels. He just does not care about the tribal lines people draw in the sand.
He hates them.
He explicitly tells his audience, I have never kept myself separate from Muslims. I don't look at someone walking through the door and ask what group they belong to.
The text is relentless on this point. He literally lists out the labels to demonstrate how absurd he finds them. Sunni, Shia, Sufi, Salafi, Wahhabi, Shafi, Hanafi. He names a dozen different sects, movements, and legal schools.
And what's his conclusion?
His conclusion for every single one is the same. I don't care what you call yourself as long as your foundation is built upon the revelation. The Quran is his absolute singular metric for unity. He views sectarianism as a literal disease, a cognitive failure that fractures the potential unity of 1.5 billion people over petty, human-made branding.
But if you are listening to this, you're probably thinking exactly what one of the audience members asks.
Which is?
They say, okay, sure, we shouldn't judge people by their sect. But some leaders are obviously corrupt. Some teachers are running scams. If we ignore the labels, how do we know who is actually sincere? How do we protect ourselves if we can't judge them?
It is the ultimate practical question, and the speaker's answer is an exercise in profound, almost uncomfortable humility. He essentially tells them, we don't know. We absolutely do not possess a sincerity meter.
He jokes about it. He says, if I invent a sincerity meter, I'll be sure to let you know.
He uses humor to disarm the audience, but the underlying point is deadly serious. Sincerity is an entirely internal, invisible state of the heart, and therefore it belongs entirely and exclusively to the jurisdiction of God. Human beings simply do not have the sensory organs or the authority to judge the hidden contents of another human's heart.
To prove this limitation on human judgment, he brings up another incredibly powerful historical anecdote, the story of Usama bin Zaid. Tell us about the context of this battle, because it shows how high the stakes really are when it comes to judging intent.
Usama bin Zaid was a young, highly capable commander appointed by the Prophet. During a frantic, violent skirmish, Usama was fighting an enemy soldier. They are locked in mortal combat.
His life or death.
Life or death. Just as Usama gains the upper hand and is literally about to strike the final fatal blow with his sword, the enemy soldier suddenly throws up his hands and declares the Islamic declaration of faith. He recites the Shahada.
And Usama, looking at this guy who was trying to kill him 5 seconds ago, assumes it's a complete lie. He assumes the man is only saying the magic words to save his own neck. So Usama swings the sword and kills him anyway.
Exactly. From a purely logical human battlefield perspective, Usama's calculation makes total sense. You'd think the guy was just trying to survive. But when the Prophet heard about what happened, he was not just disappointed, he was furious. He reprimanded Usama severely.
Usama tried to defend himself.
Yes. Usama tried to defend his logic, saying, messenger of God, he only said it to escape the sword, he wasn't sincere. And what did the Prophet say in response?
It is such a chilling, powerful image. The Prophet asks him, did you split his heart open to look?
Did you split his heart open? It is the ultimate immovable boundary on human judgment. The speaker uses this devastating question to establish a rule for his audience. We are only authorized to judge by outward actions, and we measure those outward actions against the text of the Quran.
But the inside is off limits.
The internal machinery, the sincerity, the true intent, the secret thoughts, is a sealed black box. We are explicitly not authorized to pry it open. If a person is hypocritical, if they are lying about their faith, that is a matter strictly between them and God. Our job is to evaluate the outward evidence and leave the internal reality alone.
And evaluating the outward evidence leads us into the final and undoubtedly the most sensitive segment of the text. It's a segment about justice, bigotry, and the absolute non-negotiable necessity of separating a person's individual actions from their ethnic or religious identity.
Again, exploring this requires us to look closely at how the speaker navigates a highly charged geopolitical environment. The context here is the ongoing devastating conflict in Gaza, where emotions, anger, and grief are running incredibly high among his audience.
Understandably so.
An audience member asks the speaker about a series of billboards that had recently appeared in their city in Turkey. These billboards featured a direct quote from the Torah, "Thou shalt not kill," alongside statements condemning the violence as a crime against humanity paid for by a Jewish organization. The audience member is deeply cynical. They ask, is this just a strategic PR move by Jewish communities in Turkey to protect themselves from backlash? How should we interpret this?
The audience member is basically asking for permission to be suspicious, to assume bad faith, to lump everyone into one monolithic enemy group, and the speaker shuts that cynicism down immediately. He refuses to give them that permission.
Completely. He tells the questioner not to be so conspiratorial and cynical. He says, if there is even a tiny drop of goodness in this action, acknowledge it, appreciate it. He actively refuses to let the legitimate anger over the conflict in Gaza curdle into a blanket racist hatred of Jewish people.
He poses a question directly to his audience in a very raw, challenging way to shock them out of their tribalism. He says, imagine you found a Jewish child. Would you harm them? Could you eat them raw or cooked?
He's using this extreme, grotesque imagery to jolt their conscience.
Of course not, he says. If you do harm an innocent, what difference is there between you and an oppressor?
He is drawing a hard, unbreakable line between political ideology and human identity. To explain this, he introduces a concept he terms Judaization. Now, we need to be very clear about how he defines this because it is crucial.
Right, let's unpack that term.
In his framework, Judaization is absolutely not about the Jewish faith or the Jewish people themselves. He defines Judaization as a psychological disease, a form of toxic ethno-nationalism, racism, and exclusivity that cloaks itself in the sanctity of religion.
Right. It is the belief that your specific bloodline or your specific tribe is divinely superior to all others, and therefore you are justified in committing violence or oppression against the lesser people. Yeah. He is attacking the ideology of supremacy, not the religion of Judaism.
Exactly. And the most vital part of his argument is that he turns this critique directly back onto his own Muslim audience.
He doesn't let them off the hook.
Not at all. He explicitly warns them that they are just as susceptible to this exact same Judaization of the mind as anyone else. He tells them, if you start believing that being Muslim gives you the right to be unjust or that your blood is better than someone else's blood, you have adopted the exact supremacy you claim to be fighting against. He says, if we don't clean our own house, the things we hate today will appear among us tomorrow.
To hammer home the point that you absolutely cannot judge an entire group by the actions of a political entity, he tells one final historical story. And this is a fascinating one. The story of Mukarik.
Mukarik was a highly respected, very wealthy Jewish rabbi living in Medina during the time of the Prophet Muhammad. The context is the Battle of Uhud, which was a critical, desperate moment when the early Muslim community was facing a devastating existential attack from outside forces.
Everything was on the line.
Yes. Mukarik surveyed the political and moral landscape, and he decided to fight alongside the Muslims.
But the crucial detail, the detail the speaker emphasizes to his audience, is that Mukarik did not convert to Islam. He didn't recite the Shahada. He remained a devout, practicing Jew.
Right.
But he recognized the inherent justice of the Prophet's cause in that specific moment, and he recognized the injustice of the attacking army. He fought for the universal principle of justice, not for tribal alignment.
And he was killed in the battle. He gave his life for that justice. The speaker highlights how the Prophet reacted to Mukarik's death. The Prophet didn't discard his body because he wasn't part of the Muslim tribe. He didn't bury him far away in an unmarked grave.
Yeah.
He honored him deeply. He ordered him buried near the Muslim martyrs and gave him a beautiful title, the best of the Jews.
The best of the Jews, which the speaker uses as the ultimate proof that even in the absolute extremes of a war zone, the foundational texts demand what he calls a distinguishing mind. A mind that is capable of separating the bad actors from the good. A mind that values the universal divine principle of justice over the base. Human instinct to hate an entire group of people.
The speaker uses a very simple, grounded metaphor to explain this distinguishing mind. He says, just because you find one small stone in a large sack of rice, you don't throw the entire sack of rice in the garbage. You pick out the stone.
Yeah.
Just because you see one wormy apple on a tree, you don't declare hatred for the entire orchard. He is demanding that his audience maintain their moral nuance, even and especially when they are deeply angry and grieving.
Okay, we have covered an immense, sweeping amount of ground today. The roots have gone very deep. If we pull all these massive concepts together, what is the architecture of this worldview?
The grand arc of this deep dive is truly a journey from the absolute, untouched heights of divine theology down into the gritty, painful reality of human ethics. It all started with the linguistic root of a single Arabic prefix, el, which served as the foundation for the argument that absolute, finalized perfection, mukammal, belongs exclusively to God.
Right. We explored how the physical reality of time is a creation, meaning God is timeless, and how our human brains literally cannot compute that. We debated the idea that the simple biological act of breathing is an unconscious, continuous testimony to the divine source of life.
Yeah.
But then the text brought that high theology crashing down into human sociology.
Because if perfection belongs only to God, then the human demand for perfection is toxic. Putting leaders on pedestals, idolizing them, and expecting them to be flawless is a destructive force. It ruins their morality, forces them into hypocrisy, and turns them into fake idols.
From there, we looked at what true, messy human sincerity actually looks like. Not measured through the sheer volume of wealth on a spreadsheet, but measured through blistered hands and the percentage of sacrifice captured by the cameras of heaven.
And finally, we saw the speaker demand that this exact same sincerity and critical thinking be applied to how we view history and our fellow human beings. We must reject the fabricated myths of ethno-nationalism.
We must judge people by their individual actions and their adherence to justice, not by their sectarian labels or ethnic tribes. We must cultivate a distinguishing mind while leaving the ultimate judgment of a person's hidden heart to God alone.
It is a worldview that demands deep roots. It flat out refuses the superficial.
And as we wrap up, it leaves us with a fascinating, slightly uncomfortable parallel to our own modern world. We started this deep dive by noting the contradiction between breathing as proof of God and demanding perfection as the destruction of human morality.
Right.
The speaker warned his audience about the intense spiritual danger of demanding their religious leaders be flawless, arguing that it forces them to become fake, image-obsessed actors.
It strips them of the grace to be human, to fail, and to learn from that failure.
Right. So here's a lingering thought for you to chew on as you go about your day. In our highly secular, highly connected modern digital world, we don't usually elevate religious figures to demigod status anymore.
No, we have different idols.
We do. Look at our culture of social media. Look at cancel culture. We demand absolute, unblemished, historical perfection from our public figures, our celebrities, our politicians, and even our peers. One mistake, one bad joke from a decade ago can permanently end a career and ruin a life.
It's true.
If assigning absolute perfection to our leaders actually strips them of their humanity and ruins their morality, is our modern cancel culture just a twisted secular form of that exact same destructive idol worship? Are we demanding a divine mukammal standard from people who are biologically and inherently just flawed, Camille works in progress?
It is a question that requires us to look past the superficial fringes of our outrage and examine the deep roots of our own expectations.
Keep seeking those roots beneath the soil. Thanks for exploring with us. We will catch you next time.
This material is a transcript of a theological lecture exploring the absolute perfection of God's names, the dangers of idolizing human leaders, and the practical application of faith through charity and historical awareness.
Yeah, let's get right into the feedback.
So let's look closely at the section discussing the Arabic prefix el in the Esma-ul Husna.
Right, the beautiful names of God.
Exactly. The material deeply analyzes how this specific definite article denotes God's absolute exclusivity and perfection.
It's a really rigorous breakdown.
It is, yeah. We get this breakdown of how terms like alim, meaning knowing, or basar, meaning seeing, denote these shared kind of limited traits when they're used without the prefix.
Like human traits, basically.
Yeah, exactly. But the moment you add the El to make it El-Alim or El-Basir, it shifts that attribute into an exclusive, absolute, completely divine domain.
Right, it belongs only to God at that point.
Yes. And the author masterfully contrasts this divine perfection with the inherent, unavoidable flaws of human beings.
They point out the prophets, right? Like the absolute highest echelon of humanity?
Yeah, they remind us of Adam's mistake in the garden, Musa's accidental manslaughter, and Yunus abandoning his post at Nineveh.
Which is a brilliant way to establish a flawless theological baseline.
It really is. But then, it abruptly shifts to discussing modern religious followers and like how they ruin the morals of their sheikhs by attributing absolute perfection to them.
Yeah, that pivot is intense.
It feels as though the author is holding this linguistic magnifying glass to ancient texts, like looking at a diamond under a jeweler's loupe, you know?
Where every facet is mathematically precise.
Right. But then they suddenly whip around to hold up a sociological mirror, reflecting the absolute chaos of modern human behavior.
It causes a significant amount of intellectual whiplash, honestly.
It really does.
Is there a risk that focusing solely on the shock value of that transition might overlook the underlying philosophical truth the author is trying to convey?
I mean, maybe.
Let's unpack the mechanics of this shift. The transition between the dense linguistic analysis of divine perfection and the sociological warning against idolizing human leaders creates a structural rupture that risks losing the audience's conceptual momentum.
Yeah, that's a really good way to frame it.
The core weakness here is that the text jumps straight from explaining ancient grammar rules and the historical fallibility of prophets directly into a psychological warning about disciples projecting perfection onto their spiritual leaders.
Like there's no middle ground there at all?
Exactly. We are moving from a highly academic discussion about a definite article and its implications on the theology of Tawhid straight into this hyper-specific, almost colloquial scenario.
Where followers literally believe their sheikh knows how many times they roll over in bed at night.
Right. The conceptual leap from ancient linguistic theology to modern human psychology is incredibly sudden.
Because it lacks a guided path, right?
Yes, the audience is left scrambling to connect the abstract dots between the grammar of God's names and the behavioral practice of everyday people projecting omniscience onto their human teachers.
That makes a lot of sense, but it also raises a question about the author's underlying intent, because, the raw material for that connection is certainly present in the text.
Oh, definitely. The insight is there.
Yeah, the author accurately points out that treating a human as perfect forces that human to become an actor.
They have to fake their piety to maintain the illusion that their followers demand.
Exactly. It's a remarkably astute insight into how we destroy the humanity of the people we idolize. So, how does the author bridge that gap without losing the intellectual rigor of the linguistic opening?
Well, to fix this, the author needs to establish a clear philosophical hinge that explicitly links the linguistic rules to the sociological behaviors.
So you can't just imply it.
No, you cannot just imply the connection. You need to show the reader the exact mechanism of how a grammatical misunderstanding of divine attributes translates into a psychological disaster in real time.
Okay, so what would that look like in practice?
For concrete examples of how to execute this, the author could introduce a framing concept like spiritual trespassing.
Spiritual trespassing. I like that. Right.
After defining the El prefix as an indicator of absolute divine perfection, the text should explicitly explain that human suffering and moral decay begin the exact moment we take this linguistic absolute and apply it to fragile human beings in the real world.
Show the reader how treating a human scholar as the all-knowing.
Granting them the conceptual El, basically.
Yeah, how that forces them to wear a divine mask.
Exactly. Explain that this expectation destroys their humanity. It makes them hyper-aware of their public image. It denies them the human right to repent for mistakes.
Which goes right back to the prophets making mistakes.
Exactly. And ultimately, it leads to the very shirk or association that the opening theology warns against.
That ties it all together beautifully.
Now, utilizing a specific term like spiritual trespassing is just one out of all the possible ways of solving this structural problem, of course.
Right, they could use different phrasing.
Yeah, the fundamental requirement is just that the author must build a recognizable conceptual bridge.
Well, by introducing a bridge like that, you take the abstract grammar and turn it into an actionable, urgent warning.
It grounds the theology in human consequence.
And if we repair the internal transitions between theology and psychology, we must also address how the material integrates external, real-world applications into this theoretical framework.
I absolutely agree. Where do we see this tension between theory and application happening most prominently in the text?
Well, the material makes a strong case for practical faith by highlighting passionate, contemporary segments about charity, specifically for Gaza.
Right, those sections were really moving.
They were. We hear this deeply moving story about the donation of socks by a street vendor who literally gave up his entire day's capital for the cause.
Such a powerful image.
Yeah. And then we get the historical analogy of the companion at Tabuk, the water drawer who worked until his hands blistered just to donate a handful of dates to the prophet.
Right.
But alongside these profound narratives, we also get administrative updates.
Like logistical stuff?
Yeah. The speaker details sister family aid projects, pushes for subscriptions to a specific magazine, outlines an 18-point manifesto on education, and gives these rapid-fire historical book recommendations.
Ah, okay.
Now, I want to push back a bit on critiquing this inclusion. Aren't these deeply emotional, contemporary stories of charity, and even the gritty reality of logistics, exactly the kind of vibrant, real-world stakes needed to keep a heavy theological lecture from becoming too dry?
I see where you're coming from.
Like, doesn't this on-the-ground reality actually validate the theology?
That makes sense. But could the evidence also support a different conclusion? Like these logistical elements actually competing with the theology rather than supporting it?
Competing with it? How so?
The raw integration of contemporary geopolitical updates and charity logistics dilutes the core theological thesis rather than amplifying it.
Okay, break that down for me.
The weakness here lies entirely in presentation and structural hierarchy. The deeply emotional segments about the Gaza sock donation, the Ottoman history book recommendations, the logistics of the Sister Family Project.
They're all undeniably powerful, yeah.
They are, but they arrive as jarring interruptions to the primary discourse.
Oh, because they're presented essentially as administrative announcements or side tangents?
Exactly. They feel like separate agenda items rather than a thematic extension of the core lesson on God's attributes.
I guess that's true. It's a huge shift in scale.
Right. When you transition from exploring the boundless, timeless nature of the Creator, where terms like before and after lose all meaning, into a localized announcement about 4 aid trucks arriving and 2 more on the way,
the conceptual scale of the piece just collapses.
Exactly. The underlying majestic logic of the theology gets buried under administrative housekeeping and magazine subscription pushes.
It's essentially the difference between discussing the awe-inspiring physics of light and then suddenly pausing to ask the audience to chip in for the electric bill.
That is a brilliant analogy. Both involve electricity, but the mundane reality of the latter completely shatters the transcendent awe of the former.
Yeah. I mean, the author's intention is clearly to mobilize the audience to action, which is a vital goal for a lecture of this nature.
Absolutely.
But the execution actively interrupts the intellectual flow we just worked so hard to establish.
That is a highly accurate way to frame the dissonance. To correct this, the suggestion is to restructure these real-world elements so they serve as direct, illustrative applications of the specific theological attributes being discussed.
So they shouldn't exist as standalone announcements.
Right. The author needs to metamorphose the logistics into liturgy.
Wow. Metamorphose the logistics into liturgy. I like that phrasing. How would they do that?
For concrete examples, when detailing the charitable act of the sock seller, or the man drawing water from the well for a few dates at Tabuk, explicitly frame these stories as reflections of human limitation, striving for ultimate sincerity.
And contrast them against God's absolute provision.
Yes, the attribute of a rizak. The author must explain that the street vendor isn't just giving away socks, he is participating in the divine attribute of generosity within his severely limited human capacity.
Which then points back to the infinite capacity of the divine.
Exactly. Furthermore, the author should shift the purely logistical updates, the administrative pushes for the magazine subscription, and the rapid-fire historical book recommendations to a strictly dedicated epilogue separated from the core lecture.
That makes a lot of sense. Keep the housekeeping at the very end.
Whether they use an epilogue or find another framing device, these are just a few out of all possible ways of solving the problem. The ultimate goal is ensuring the theology drives the action rather than the action interrupting the theology.
By doing that, you're essentially proposing that the author turn a mundane administrative announcement into an active theological demonstration.
It honors the intent to inspire action, but binds it to the lesson,
making the charity an active demonstration of the theology. Now, this tendency to introduce massive, disparate topics is most pronounced at the very end of the material during the audience interaction.
Which brings us to our final point regarding the climax of the piece.
Right.
The ending of a piece like this is so critical. It is the final synthesis of all the complex ideas presented.
And it's the lasting impression left in the reader's mind. So, a key theme running through this material seems to be a fearless willingness to tackle complex, controversial questions head-on.
The Q&A section really goes everywhere.
It does. The final section of the transcript consists of a rapid-fire Q&A covering incredibly diverse and heavy topics. In just a few minutes, the speaker addresses the legal language of prayer,
citing that specific historical text. Yeah.
Poignantly noting it was dictated from a prison cell. Then pivots sharply to the ethics of a public billboard campaign featuring the 10 Commandments.
Talk about whiplash again.
From there, the speaker delves into a highly nuanced geopolitical distinction between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and finally drops a stunning historical anecdote about the Jewish warrior Mustafaİslamoğlu fighting alongside Muslims at the Battle of Uhud.
It is a lot of ground to cover.
It is. Now, what if this uncurated, scattershot nature of a Q&A is actually a deliberate stylistic choice?
How do you mean?
Isn't there a certain narrative charm to showcasing the raw authenticity and intellectual agility of the speaker, fielding whatever heavy topic is thrown at them in real time?
That's fascinating. What are the potential limitations or counter-arguments to that idea, though?
Well, I suppose a written text is different from a live room.
Exactly. While raw authenticity is compelling in a live setting, we have to ask how it serves the narrative arc of a published written transcript. The inclusion of a rapid-fire, uncurated Q&A section at the conclusion fragments the thematic resonance of the piece and leaves profound philosophical concepts underdeveloped.
It diffuses all the energy.
Yes. The core weakness is that the piece ends with a series of responses covering massive, earth-shattering concepts in mere sentences.
You just can't do justice to the legal nuances of prayer language and complex historical interfaith dynamics in 2 minutes.
You can't. Packing these heavy, entirely unrelated themes into the final moments severely weakens the narrative climax. The cognitive load on an audience at the end of a dense theological lecture is already incredibly high.
They're tired. They've been thinking hard.
Right. When you introduce entirely new arguments, new historical characters like Mustafaİslamoğlu, and new geopolitical dilemmas just as the material is supposed to be winding down, you deny the audience the opportunity to synthesize what they've already learned.
Because they're suddenly trying to figure out this brand new story.
Exactly. The fundamental mechanism of a strong ending is convergence. Bringing all the established threads together into a single resonant point.
Here the threads run spooling in a dozen different directions,
actively diluting the impact of everything that came before it.
The visual that comes to mind is building a magnificent, highly structured architectural wonder. And then just as you're about to unveil the capstone to the crowd, you start throwing loose bricks into the audience.
Yes, that is exactly what it feels like.
The Mustafaİslamoğlu story is a perfect example of this. The speaker notes that this wealthy rabbi fought at Uhud, left his wealth to the Muslims, and was later called the best of the Jews by the prophet.
It is an incredibly potent anecdote.
It perfectly illustrates the speaker's earlier point about the dangers of racism and how we cannot make absolute monolithic judgments about entire groups of people.
Because only God possesses absolute qualities. It ties right back to the prefix El.
Exactly. But because it is tucked away at the very end of a chaotic Q&A, it just feels like historical trivia rather than the profound philosophical anchor it should be.
Narrative real estate at the end of the text is simply too valuable for trivia.
So how do we fix the climax?
To resolve this, the author needs to extract the most potent philosophical insights from the Q&A and weave them seamlessly into the main body of the text to support the central arguments.
And what about the rest of the Q&A?
Actively discard the less relevant administrative or highly localized answers from the final published transcript.
Just cut them.
Yes. For concrete examples, the author should take that brilliant historical anecdote about Muhayraq fighting at Uhud and integrate it much earlier in the text.
Place it right when the material discusses human fallibility.
Yes, and the inherent danger of making absolute, sweeping judgments about groups of people. It provides the perfect historical anchor for that specific theological point.
That makes so much more sense structurally.
Furthermore, the author could utilize a different audience question, like the one about adopting the morality of God, as the concluding thesis statement of the entire piece.
Oh, I love that part. In the text, the speaker beautifully corrects this phrasing to the morality of the Quran.
Right, explaining that God doesn't have a created human-level morality.
Using that specific exchange as the finale provides a strong, resonant ending about human aspiration.
Relocating these specific anecdotes and utilizing the morality question as a finale represent just a handful of all possible ways to solve the problem of a fractured conclusion, of course.
But the guiding principle must be curation for the sake of thematic unity.
Precisely.
Utilizing that specific theological correction, shifting the audience's mindset from adopting Allah's morality to adopting the morality of the Quran as the final thought, it is incredibly sharp.
It really is.
It brings the entire lecture full circle. It brings the reader right back to the opening discussion of language, the absolute exclusivity of divine attributes, and exactly how limited humans are supposed to relate to the divine without overstepping.
It is the perfect synthesis of the entire text. It takes all of that raw intellectual energy, which was previously scattered across a dozen Q&A topics, and points it precisely at a single, unforgettable target for the reader.
Exactly. To summarize our critique today, we focused on 3 main areas to elevate this material from a raw transcript into a cohesive, impactful piece of writing.
Starting with structure.
Right. First, we discussed structure and flow, specifically the need to create explicit thematic bridges, like the concept of spiritual trespassing, to connect the dense linguistic theology of God's perfect names with the human psychology of idolizing leaders.
Second, we addressed completeness and focus.
Yeah, by restructuring the logistical tangents. Instead of raw administrative updates interrupting the text, we explored weaving those powerful charity anecdotes directly into the definitions of God's attributes.
Ultimately, metamorphosing logistics into liturgy.
Love that phrase. And finally, we looked at angle and originality by curating the final Q&A. We highlighted the importance of moving profound historical points, like the Muhayraq anecdote, into the main narrative where they can breathe.
And using the strongest philosophical insights to create a unified, resonant ending, rather than a fragmented one.
Those structural and thematic shifts will ensure that the audience doesn't just read the information, but actually understands the underlying mechanics of the theology, feeling its weight applying directly to their modern lives.
We highly encourage the author to implement these structural changes, reorganize those brilliant historical and modern anecdotes to better serve the core thesis, and submit the revised material back to us for another critique.
I would absolutely love to read the next iteration of this material.
The foundational knowledge and the historical references here are staggering. The text simply requires that deliberate architectural alignment to reach its full potential.
At the very beginning of this critique, we talked about the jarring difference between looking through a jeweler's loupe at a mathematically perfect diamond and then suddenly being forced to stare into a cracked mirror reflecting human chaos.
Yeah, the whiplash.
Exactly. But when this material is properly bridged and structurally aligned, the audience won't have to choose between the two.
They'll be integrated.
They will be able to look directly into that cracked mirror of human history and psychology and clearly see the reflection of the divine diamonds shining right back at them.
Welcome to the debate. Imagine discovering that attempting to emulate the absolute best qualities of the divine, like trying to be perfectly just, perfectly compassionate, or perfectly knowing, isn't actually a path to righteousness.
Right. It's actually a fast track to idolatry.
And moral ruin.
Exactly. Today, we are asking a very dangerous theological question.
Yeah, it sounds entirely counterintuitive, right? I mean, I know if you're listening to this right now, your internal monologue is probably saying, wait, isn't religion entirely based on trying to be more like God?
You would think so.
But today we are exploring the profound linguistic framework of Esma-ul Husna, the most beautiful names of Allah, as presented in our source material. We are examining how the exact phrasing, down to the grammatical structure of these Arabic names, defines an absolute impenetrable boundary between the creator and the created. And the core tension we're exploring today centers on the primary function of this theological boundary. Like, does an understanding of absolute divine perfection primarily serve as a metaphysical guidepost to, elevate human spiritual progress? Does it act as a metaphorical mirror for us to look into?
Or does it fundamentally function as a strict prohibitive boundary, one that's meant to prevent the moral and societal corruption that inevitably happens when humans claim perfection for themselves?
Right. It is fundamentally a question of aspiration versus strict prohibition.
Exactly.
I argue that the absolute linguistic precision of the names provides a profound framework that allows humans to embark on a necessary journey of spiritual progression. By understanding the names, we can reflect divine attributes on a human proportionate scale.
And I counter that the primary purpose of reserving perfection solely for God is a protective sociological and moral barrier. Attributing perfection to any human, even prophets or revered leaders, inevitably destroys human morality and leads directly to idolatry.
Well, let's lay the groundwork by looking directly at the linguistic architecture our source material provides. The text uses the grammatical structure of the names to build this majestic metaphysical framework that actually defines the human spiritual journey.
Right, it's very specific.
It is. It focuses heavily on the definite article el, which is basically the equivalent of the in English, or the lami tarif in Arabic. For our listeners who don't speak Arabic, el carries massive metaphysical weight here. When we say someone is a creator versus the creator, we aren't just tweaking grammar.
No, you're entirely shifting reality.
Exactly. We are fundamentally changing the entire category of existence.
Because it implies absolute intrinsic perfection.
Right. When we say El-Karim, so the generous, or Er-Rahman, the merciful, that El indicates a perfection that is entirely self-sustaining. But the text also points out names without the El, like Aliman, meaning knowing, or Basiran, seeing.
Which implies something a bit different, right?
Yeah, they imply a limitless perfection beyond our comprehension of time and causality. By understanding this massive gap, humans can recognize that our own attributes are merely borrowed. Human mercy is conditional, but God's mercy is intrinsic. But here is my thesis. Recognizing this gap doesn't push us away. It actually invites us to pursue the path of the inside camel.
I think we need to define that term clearly for the audience because that is exactly where our paths diverge.
Absolutely. Insana camel translates to the human engaged in the ongoing process of completion or maturation. Like we are not meant to be the insanimo camel, which is a flawed concept of an already flawless perfect human.
An impossible standard.
Right. We are defined by our striving. The names give us the ultimate reference point to strive toward.
And that is where I fundamentally disagree with your framing. Because the core thesis of the material isn't a roadmap for human spiritual aspiration. It's a strict, uncompromising warning.
A warning against striving?
A warning against emulation. Let's look at the phrase, taking on the morals of Allah. The source makes a fascinating linguistic point here that I think completely upends your argument. It explicitly warns against this phrasing because the Arabic word for morality or character, which is hulk, shares its root with the concept of creation.
Wait, so you're saying we can't even say God has a moral character?
Precisely. Because to have a moral character implies you are navigating a created framework of right and wrong, cause and effect. God is not created. God is the creator of the framework itself. Applying hulk to God is technically and structurally flawed.
I mean, language has its limits.
Exactly. Language is a human invention designed to describe human experiences, and it inherently fails when applied to the infinite. The text's true focus is on the devastating moral consequences of trying to blur that line.
like when followers demand perfection from religious leaders, sheiks, or saints. It utterly destroys the leader's morality.
How so?
The text gives a chilling psychological example. Imagine a follower who genuinely believes their leader knows the unseen, like knowing exactly how many times they toss and turn in bed at night.
All right, so the leader becomes trapped by that expectation?
Trapped is an understatement. That leader is forced to become a hypocritical actor. They have to role-play perfection just to maintain the illusion for the followers. They become what the text bluntly calls playthings of Satan. The absolute boundary of the names is there to save us from this toxic dynamic.
Okay, I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on how those linguistic absolutes actually function. Let's look at the phrase El-Hüsna. The material specifies that it doesn't just mean most beautiful in a comparative sense.
Right, it has layers.
Right, it means the only beautiful, always beautiful, and very beautiful. All of these nuances exist simultaneously. Now, to your point about the boundary being impenetrable, think about it conceptually, like a 2D drawing trying to capture a 3D object.
Okay, a dimensional difference. I'm listening.
A 2D drawing of a cube isn't a cube. It fundamentally lacks depth. But it is still a representation of the cube within its limited dimensions. When the text talks about human attributes like being Rauf, which is compassionate, or Rahim, merciful, it explicitly contrasts our 2D version with God's absolute 3D reality.
Because ours is reactive.
Exactly. Your compassion is a reaction. You owe it to an external trigger, like someone else's suffering. God's compassion is intrinsic. But the very fact that we share the vocabulary, that we can draw the 2D square, is an invitation. We are capable of a borrowed, conditional mercy. The linguistic absolute of God's perfection isn't a locked door. It's the 3D reality that gives our 2D existence its shape and purpose.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why that dimensional emulation framing is still incredibly dangerous and honestly runs directly counter to the text. You are still treating the gap between human and divine as a matter of translation, like we just lack a dimension.
Well, we do lack a dimension.
But the material argues it is a category error to even attempt the drawing because God's attributes are utterly incomprehensible to the human mind. The text focuses heavily on the mechanics of time to prove this.
You mean the idea that God created time so time doesn't apply to him?
Exactly. Human knowledge is entirely bound by causality. We only know things before they happen as a prediction or after they happen as a memory. But if a being created time itself, the very concepts of before and after are rendered meaningless. It's absurd to apply them.
Right, but
you cannot capture a being entirely outside of time within a mind that cannot function without time. This is why the material quotes the famous lines from the Ottoman poet Ziya Pasha. This small mind cannot comprehend such heights, for this scale cannot bear such weight. True understanding isn't trying to draw the 3D cube. True understanding is realizing your utter inability to comprehend the dimension in the first place. The realization of your incapacity is the comprehension.
Okay, but if we follow that logic to its extreme that God is entirely outside of time and comprehension and the gap is so vast it only serves as a prohibition, doesn't that make the human experience entirely irrelevant to him?
Not irrelevant, just distinct.
But if emulation is impossible, what are we doing here? We know that's not the case because he sent prophets, human beings firmly bound by time. And the material specifically addresses the prophets in a way that proves my point about the insani kamil, the striving human.
How so?
Because the prophets are the ultimate example of human limitation.
Exactly. The Quran deliberately highlights the flaws, the missteps, and the mistakes of its absolute greatest figures. It doesn't hide them. It mentioned Adam's sin of eating from the tree. It mentions Jonah fleeing his societal duty when the pressure got too high and the knife reached the bone.
Right.
It brings up Moses' accidental killing before his prophethood and David's deep repentance. It even references the stern warnings given to the prophet Muhammad in the chapter of Abasa when he frowned and turned away from a blind man. Why broadcast these flaws for all of eternity?
To show they are human.
The proof that a flawless human in insanu mukemmel does not exist and is not the goal. Even the prophets were on a journey of progression. They were insanu kamil. They are defined by their striving, their profound repentance, their upward trajectory toward that divine standard. They weren't static perfection.
I hear what you're saying.
The text explicitly says the servant cannot be flawless. This highlights the beautiful mechanism of the human struggle. We are defined by how we try to cross the distance, even if we never arrive.
I completely accept the evidence of the prophets you just laid out, but you are entirely flipping the interpretation. Highlighting the flaws of the prophets isn't some heartwarming, inspirational message about the beauty of human striving. It is the text's ultimate aggressive weapon against human deification.
Wait, you think it's purely preventative?
It is a massive stop sign. Think about it. If the Quran is willing to publicly document the mistakes of the greatest human beings to ever walk the earth, it is sending a definitive, terrifying warning to us. Do not elevate anyone.
The material brings up the specific historical example of Christians elevating Jesus to divinity,
which the text heavily critiques.
Right. The text asks a piercing question. Did they honor Jesus by doing this? No. They ruined his message, and they condemned themselves. Ascribing perfection to humans isn't a compliment. It is a profound injustice to the human being.
Well, as the material points out, Jesus himself, according to the Quran, washes his hands of this idolatry on the Day of Judgment. When you try to attribute absolute attributes like El-Basir, the all-seeing, to a human leader, claiming they see everything, you aren't honoring them. You are stripping them of their humanity.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently, especially when we look at how God actually evaluates human action in the text. If the barrier between human fallibility and divine perfection is as absolute and punitive as you suggest, how does God value our inherently flawed human actions? If we can't reach the standard, why does the effort matter?
Because the effort is all we have, but the evaluation metric is different.
Let's look at the evaluation metric then. The material provides an incredibly powerful historical example from the Battle of Tabuk. Let's set the scene for the listeners. The prophet was gathering funds for a massive, difficult campaign. The wealthy of Medina were bringing jaw-dropping donations, loads of gold, 100 camels, 50 camels, the visible, tangible accumulation of perfection, right?
The dictionary definition of measurable success, yeah.
Exactly. But then there was one laborer, an Ansar. He didn't have gold. He spent the entire night pulling heavy buckets of water from a well for a Jewish landowner. His hands blistered, his muscles ached, he was covered in sweat. And for all that agonizing labor, his wages were 2 scales of dates.
Just 2 scales?
Just 2. He kept half a scale for his starving family, and he brought 1.5 scales to the prophet. He placed that tiny, pathetic-looking handful of dates on top of the mountains of golden camels. The onlookers scoffed. And what does the text say?
That it was accepted.
More than accepted. The prophet declared that those dates were heavier and better than the massive wealth of the others. God accepted the dates. Doesn't this prove that God's absolute perfection actively validates and elevates flawed, limited human sincerity? The divine standard isn't just a barrier. It's a mechanism that gives infinite weight to our finite, sincere efforts.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered that the story of the date giver actually reinforces the absolute limits of human judgment rather than human emulation of the divine?
How does validating his effort limit human judgment?
Let's look closely at why the rich donors and the onlookers mocked the man with the dates. Why did they scoff? Because they were relying on what the material brilliantly calls the dictatorship of numbers.
Ah, right.
Numbers are a human metric. They are measurable, they are visible, and they are entirely superficial. God accepted the 1.5 scales of dates precisely because God does not look at the numbers. God looks at the core of the heart. God's camera, the text says, is the only one that can photograph the heart. And here is the crucial psychological point. The heart is an unseen space that no human can judge.
Right, which highlights God's unique capacity. It proves he sees our 2D effort.
Yes, but it also highlights our strict prohibition from entering that space. This is precisely why leaders or sheiks who claim to know the unseen or claim to judge the sincerity of their followers' hearts are committing a grave moral crime. We are humans. We must judge by explicit actions what the text calls the bayan,
the outward declaration.
The explicit statement.
Yes. If someone declares their faith, we accept it. We cannot split their heart open to check their sincerity. The material reminds us that the Prophet himself furiously reprimanded Usama bin Zayd for killing an enemy soldier who uttered the declaration of faith at the last second.
Usama assumed he was faking it.
Right, Usama assumed the man was faking it to save his life. The Prophet asked him, "Did you split his heart open to see?" The story of the dates proves that the internal reality belongs strictly to God. When we respect that boundary, we maintain social order and justice. When we try to cross it, we play God, and we destroy our own morality.
But, don't you think that by entirely divorcing human capability from the divine standard, you risk a kind of moral nihilism? Like, I can't be perfect, I can't judge hearts, so why bother? If we cannot emulate, if we cannot strive to reflect those names in our own limited 2D way, what are we doing?
We're submitting.
But the text famously says that our understanding of God constructs our understanding of humanity. Allah tasavvurumuzu değil, insan tasavvurumuzu inşa ediyor. By understanding El-Esma-ul Husna, we understand what a human is not, which inherently defines what a human is. A human is the being that knows it is not God, and therefore must rely on God.
I wouldn't call it moral nihilism at all. I call it moral realism. The text gives us a painfully realistic look at human psychology. Think back to that follower who believes his leader knows how many times he turns in bed. The text points out the tragic comedy of it. The leader now has to role play. He can't be seen eating normally or getting sick or, going to the bathroom because it shatters the illusion of his perfection.
It becomes a performance.
Exactly. The text reminds us that the polytheists complained about the Prophet Muhammad precisely because he ate food and walked in the markets. They wanted a perfect angel, not a human. By demanding perfection, we create hypocrites. The true moral framework is accepting our profound weakness. The text notes that humanity is so weak we don't even know what awaits us one step into the future. Embracing that weakness, rather than trying to perfectly mirror divine strength, is what actually creates a healthy, functional society.
Well, I think we are arriving at a fascinating synthesis of the material. To summarize my position, the majestic linguistic architecture of El-Esma-ul Husna, the critical distinction between the absolute El and the boundless attributes existing outside of time, provides an essential framework for human existence. It isn't merely a wall to keep us out. It is the ultimate reference point that defines our spiritual journey.
The goalposts.
In your view.
Exactly. By deeply comprehending that our own attributes like mercy, justice, and knowledge are entirely borrowed, limited, and conditional, we are profoundly humbled. But in that humility, we are given a path forward. We are freed from the impossible burden of being the insan mukammal, the flawless human. Instead, we are invited to become the insani kamel, the human who finds profound value, dignity, and acceptance in the sincere, ongoing struggle toward the light. Much like the laborer whose blistered hands offered a handful of dates that outweighed gold.
And to summarize my stance, I maintain that the primary power of reserving absolute perfection solely for God is that it literally saves humanity from its own most destructive tendencies. The text repeatedly warns us about the sociological and moral fallout of assigning divine attributes to creation. It prevents the toxic deification of religious and political leaders. Right.
It protects human morality by preventing those leaders from becoming hypocritical actors, forced to perform an impossible perfection. By stripping away our arrogance and forcing us to accept our inherent time-bound weaknesses, our inability to see the future or judge the unseen heart, this strict boundary preserves the true dignity of the human being. Ascribing perfection to humans doesn't elevate them. As we saw with the historical examples, it ruins them.
We certainly agree on the extreme danger of human arrogance. And honestly, the absolute brilliance of how the source material uses the mechanics of Arabic grammar to deconstruct the human ego. And there are so many more fascinating dimensions in this text to explore, particularly when we apply these concepts to historical events.
Absolutely. The level of nuance the text demands from us is remarkable. I'm thinking specifically about the story of Muqayriq, the Jewish man who fought alongside the Muslims at the Battle of Uhud. The prophet didn't discard him based on a broad tribal categorization. He buried him near the martyrs and explicitly called him the best of the Jews.
Right. The text calls that the distinguishing intellect. It's the ability to not throw away the good apples just because you see a few bad ones. It requires a level of precise, unbiased justice that is, frankly, incredibly difficult for humans to maintain without a divine anchor.
Because human justice is almost always clouded by emotion, tribalism, and self-interest. Divine justice, as encapsulated in the names, is absolute and unclouded. Our inability to replicate it perfectly is exactly why we must submit to it.
It always comes back to that boundary. But, instead of a dirt line on a map, perhaps it is the boundary between the canvas and the artist. The painting can reflect the artist's intention, but the canvas can never become the brush. As our source material brilliantly illuminates today, the boundary between the borrowed 2D light of humanity and the intrinsic, blinding 3D perfection of the divine is one we attempt to cross at our own peril.
Beautifully said.
Are these most beautiful names a mirror we are meant to gaze into to better ourselves, or a fortress wall built to protect us from the fire of our own arrogance? We will leave that for you to decide.